Alrighty, hello everyone and welcome to another Security Compass webinar. Today's webinar topic is turn security from a blocker to an enabler for lean software development. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Raquel Rodriguez, the events manager here at Security Compass and your host for today's webinar. Before we get started with the actual content, I'd like to give you a quick overview of Security Compass. For those of you who may not be aware of us until today, Security Compass was founded in 2004 and began with a team of experienced penetration testers. Today, we have come far and work with many large enterprises globally to manage their cybersecurity risk through balanced development automation. We have three key offerings. Our flagship product, SD Elements, enables organizations to deliver software quickly and reduce costs through automation. Our modular role-based e-learning solutions empower organizations to embrace DevSecOps, and our strategic advisory services offer expertise in cloud security, pen testing, and red teaming for a better security posture. Let's quickly go through some housekeeping items before we get started. As you might notice, you've all entered the session on mute to reduce background noise. Second, a recording of this webinar will be available after today's event. You will receive an email with a link to this recording. We will also be publishing the recording in the resources section of our website. Also, we encourage everyone to raise questions. Please submit your questions into the chat and we'll answer them during our Q&A session. Lastly, if you would like to follow up with us or you have a topic you'd like to see covered in a future webinar, please email us at contact@securitycompass.com. Like I mentioned, today's webinar topic is turn security from a blocker to an enabler for lean software development. I'm pleased to have here with me Spencer Koch, security wizard at Reddit, Simone Curzi, principal consultant at Microsoft Consulting Services, and Altez Villani, director insights research at Security Compass. Gentlemen, thank you so much for being here with me today. I know our audience is keen to hear your presentation, so I'll let you take it from here.
Wonderful. That's great. Thank you very much, Raquel. Appreciate that. And as Raquel had mentioned, please don't hesitate. Feel free to reach out if there's any questions, put them in the Q&As or in the chat window, and let's see what we can do to kind of help each other out. So let's just kick this right off. This was something that, we've come across. Simone, you had seen something like this. Let's kick off the conversation, right? Security, talk about this, security being perceived in a certain way across a number of different stakeholders. Can you talk a little bit about this?
Thank you, Altaz. Absolutely. Essentially, this picture represents the fact that we have different roles in the industry, and each of those roles see itself and the other roles in a different way. But security is seen by all those roles as the dark evil top person that stops them all. So it definitely, that's not an enabler for business. That's something, a naysayer, essentially. But shall we really do this? Shall we really focus on saying no every time? I have the story from a customer. This customer had a strong security group internally, and this security group faced at a certain point a project that had a very important business aspects. So it was important for a business, and but the project has had some problems. So the assessor that was analyzing that solution told that no, they could not go in production. They had essentially to rebuild the solution. And guess what happened? It was that person was fired, and a new person, a new security expert was involved, and that person was fired as well, and so on and so forth. At the end of the day, nobody remained in that group because they were blocking. They were not proposing alternatives. So this is a very important aspect. Security should be an enabler, should really propose to the business alternatives, and should represent the risks as they are. This is, besides also another important aspect, how we perceive the risk, how we represent the risk to the various organizations we work with. So, yeah, I will say that the topic of how we relate with the business and the fact that we consider the business perspective in our analysis and ultimately understand that this decision about accepting the risk is something that is not our responsibility, but is a business responsibility. That's where we need to go. That's the direction.
Spencer, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think there's two real big bullets for me. Is that, you know, we talk a lot about the way that IT's changed over the last 5 years with cloud adoption, people having to retool themselves and skill up on the infrastructure side or even on the development side. Security teams need to do that as well, right? So we used to be the department of no, and we used to be able to get away with that for better or for worse. We need to learn how to not do that anymore. And security departments will succeed where people can figure that out and restructure themselves. It's both a cultural shift and also kind of a mentality shift within those individuals. Being able to pull that off is a key to success, right? So I look at it just the same as the rest of IT. Everybody needs to figure out how to do IT in 2020, as crazy as a year as it's been, figure out how to go forward with it and change the way that we're interacting. The other thing I kind of think of too is, you know, if you think of a human resources department, they're not necessarily there to help, you know, the individual or the employee. They're part of a management structure, and they're looking out for the best interest of the company. If you think about that in terms of a security team's perspective too, right? Like security should emulate that, but just for IT risks rather than personnel type issues. So we're there to help make sure the business can still get the job done, deliver whatever product it is they're trying to do, and they're aware of how should we navigate this crazy world that we live in, and giving them options and consultations and things to help drive them to the best location, but not necessarily just say no. Like an HR department can't ever just say, no, we're not going to hire anybody. That'd be crazy. So why do we think the security team can get away with that as well? You know, if you kind of take those two thoughts, hopefully they do make a lot of sense. That's where we got to go.
Yeah, interesting. Let me dive into like there's so many perspectives that come into this, right? We've got, let me kind of put a scenario out there. We've got a security team, and they have inherited a portfolio of applications that they're now supposed to try to secure. They weren't involved initially in putting something like this together. So in their minds, they feel like, hey, whoa, you know, I've just inherited this mess. It was not of my making. I was not involved initially, and I'm now being asked to secure this. And if I go in and try to help fix the issue, you know, how do I navigate this really challenging environment without coming across as being a blocker? I'd like to put that as just a scenario. And so, Spencer, I'll start with you. You know, what do you do in a situation like this to help gradually unravel this and bring the organization to a situation where we know that we're more comfortable being, you know, in this future state of being more secure?
Yeah. So I feel like that's every security person's like career path. Like you show up, you're like, oh my God, I inherited this dumpster fire. What do I do? You know, it comes down to a lot of like basic vuln management or basic risk assessment. And so, you know, certainly there's a lot of resources out there to describe like what's that process flow. But for me, it's understand what the current landscape is, both from a people and an IT perspective. So I want to know like what systems are involved, what technologies we're using, who's actually responsible for doing all this stuff, how do they operate and behave, getting kind of the lay of the land, because that's going to influence what I might potentially recommend or how I'm going to approach a scenario differently. And then understanding what actually is the biggest issue. So sure, you can like do a pen test or do an assessment and find a bajillion things that are wrong. But where the value from a security team's perspective comes from is being able to succinctly say, these are the things that should immediately get fixed, right? And it's not the 100,000 bajillion things. It's a prioritize, like you got to do a risk assessment, think about what would actually move the needle the most, and then present that through and go through an iterative process. Just like a dev team is going to be iterating on features and developing things, security teams should really be doing the same thing, where you're iterating on trying to kill off the tech debt that does exist. And so just working through that process, it's pretty easy to get the technology to understand what's wrong in the environment, or to find people to help you do that assessment. Those are the easy components for a security assessment. The hard bit is now explaining to people, this is what needs to be done, finding time within those other teams that might own those processes or those technologies that you want to get fixed, explaining that, we want to go fix these things. That's all soft skills and people interactions. And a security team that is able to navigate that well will succeed, 9 times out of 10, because a lot of it, at the end of the day, a lot of it is you've got to make trade-offs, you got to make exchanges, and it's the softer side of, oh, I found a vulnerability and now I need to go patch it. It's never as simple as that, unfortunately.
Interesting. Simone, your thoughts on this?
Yes, absolutely. I have to say that I fully agree with this aspect. I would only add that, as usual, I have a specialized approach in that, which is threat modeling. Who knows me knows that this is definitely my first go-to. And in this case, that's exactly what I will do. I will try to understand in a very structured way what are the potential risks. And then I will try to understand what can be done to define options. And that is also another great point. Those options would help to define a roadmap. And this roadmap will need to be discussed with business. And ultimately, the business would decide what to select, what aspects, what issues to fix, what issues shall not be fixed because the risk will be accepted. Or even they could decide to use different approaches to address the risks that have been identified. That will not be a problem.
Yeah.
So this is definitely what I would do. And in any case, security needs to be an enabler. Now, from that point of view, I think that it's crucial to ensure that the security team works in concert with the development team. They should act as a single team, and that is typically achieved very well with the concept of a security champion. So having someone inside the development team that would represent the security team, that would essentially create a strong connection with the security team, will talk the same language of both groups. And this is great to create a much more relaxed climate between the two teams. Typically, it's the factor that we see there, returning to the picture, we see this relationship that is very strong. But typically, from my experience, this is done because the security team is very small. They have only a few persons, and they feel overburdened. So they cannot cover every project, and they have a huge responsibility. How can they do that? So they are not relaxed. If they see instead that the development team approaches their duty in the correct way, trying to anticipate the problems and addressing those problems, creating a conversation, things change completely, and the development team, and the security team is not a blocker anymore. It becomes an advisor. It becomes a part of your team because they act early. They can act early. They can recommend things early. If you involve those teams at the end of your cycle, you are done, because the only option that they could have is to tell you, well, you really built a mess.
Yeah. So let's now, I think this is a good segue to get us into specifically the software development lifecycle now. So in software development, we're going to have requirements, we'll have design, we'll have the sort of coding and testing. We're going to deploy, not implying that it's linear, it's, agile or whatever, iterative approaches that people may be using. But just from the perspective of looking at each one of these, I'd like to start to break this down and see if there are things that are currently blockers from a security perspective and what changes could be done to enable this to become lean, right? The intent of lean is to keep the flow moving, try to limit the inventory buildup and the backlog that gets people to kind of stop the pipeline from going forward. So let's start from a requirement standpoint. We have security requirements. They could be functional, non-functional security requirements, as an example. But sometimes we end up with situations where teams that are constructing these requirements find that if we bring in a security team, then this is just not going to go anywhere. They will come back and say, no, you can't do this. No, you can't do that. You can't have this front end. You can't have that front end. You have to use crypto over here. So you end up with these discussions that take place right up front at the requirement state. So Spencer, let me start with you. What are your thoughts on trying to minimize, the time that it takes to conduct these kind of requirements where we've got security involved? Are there changes that can be done?
Yeah, and so I've tried out a lot of things in my career. I think the thing that I found that the best to have worked is that if you start with high level generalizations, things that people can say fundamentally, like, yeah, okay, we should definitely be doing those types of requirements. Starting as that as your foundation. If you're in, if you're in a highly regulated environment, like God bless it, you can get anything done. But if you're trying to get security requirements into a feature, into a product or application that you're developing, just starting with high level concepts and getting people to buy in and understand what those are at the beginning, and just empower them to say, well, think about through an authorization authentication cycle, like what should those requirements be, and having really good, like, these are the high level must-haves, and codify that within a, if your team talks about, or if your devs talk about user stories, write a user story, like have templated, like this is what should exist within an application, publish that, right? If you don't use user stories and you just do straight up tickets, like you just need to speak the language that dev team speaks as well, and say these are the things that should be required. Now, if you're going to go in with the death by 400, 500 line item spreadsheet, like you just take the ASVS and ship it over to devs, they're totally going to revolt. All right, so you just have to understand which hills do you want to die on for your security requirements. And if you cannot rationalize, like explain why we need to be doing that, then maybe you shouldn't be requiring those security requirements, right? Or maybe those are going to end up being deprioritized. So, I think it's that give and take, and taking the threat modeling information that you got from hopefully a previous exercise, combining that with what are the crown jewels, what's the business environment, all of these different things that drives what requirements are going to actually go into this feature set. So it's a lot of, you need an engineer who understands what's going on and people-y, processy type engagement, but that's the only way that I've ever seen it work.
Yeah, so you kind of win them over. Okay, Simone, your thoughts on this? How do we minimize the sort of the back and forth and the building up of the inventory from a lean standpoint when we're just at the early stages in requirements?
The key point for me is to make security as a part of the development process, not as something that comes later. Is something that is part. And I love, frankly, to have to be onboarded on the very first phases of the project. So if we are talking about an agile methodology with the Scrum, for instance, at the correct moment where a security expert should be involved is a sprint 0, and then the relationship should continue and should be renewed at each and every sprint. And this allows to help also to identify those security requirements, because if you are excluding the most mature organizations, a lot of organizations do not even know what is a security requirement. They are not able to produce anything that has any reason to be. And they needed to have guidance, and to have a guidance to identify the right security requirements for a solution, you needed to understand that solution. So it's a process that works very well if it is done since the inception of the project itself, from my point of view.
Yeah, that's great. So let's move on. We've got the requirements in place. Now we're going to get into design. So there we go, Simone. Talk about threat modeling. We're in the design stages now. How do we minimize this back and forth, right? What role can security play to enable the design process?
Yes, absolutely. Security has the role through the experience of the threat model to essentially represent an interlocutor for the architects, someone that would help the architects to understand better what they are designing, what is the implication of their choices, and would anticipate potential problems. So it is very important, because a lot of time you go and design solutions thinking only to the specific functional requirements, without considering the implications, without considering the fact that a specific type of data, for example, a specific scenario may have aspects that you would not have seen previously, and therefore you needed to work to consider those aspects in your system. I highly prefer to have a vision that is very near the project, something that implies working with the team during the various sprints, instead of considering security essentially as a bunch of best practices that should be applied, because this is the only way to get it really right, at least for the projects that have that are represented high risk, because they are exposed, because they are working with data that is highly sensitive, and so on. And this is also another aspect that we should consider. Not all projects are the same. We should not try to get the same security assurance for all projects. That doesn't work. We need to understand what are the differences between the different projects, and we needed to apply the best processes for each of them, giving the most effort only to those projects that are really important.
Spencer, your thoughts?
Yeah, to build on what Simone was talking about, I think there's also a concept of centralized versus decentralized requirements. So there are things that should apply across, an entire IT project, for example, right? Like encrypted storage solutions, right? That's probably something that's not going to be involved in every single feature, but should be something that is addressed at a top level from a top-down perspective. Then there are other things like input validation and authentication, RBAC, all those types of things. Those could be in every single feature. So you definitely have to break those apart, because you want to focus your message of these are the requirements that really only pertain for this feature set. You don't want to be dumping a whole bunch of requirements, every single iteration. The other thing that I'll mention too is the value that a security team can bring is around thinking about misuse and abuse scenarios, thinking about what happens if stuff goes wrong. Like, that's where I see a lot of value from a security team. And it should be easy, because we read blogs, we see what's in the news. Like, we are the doom and gloom emporium. Like, we got them all, we know all the scenarios. But being able to explain that to somebody, like, well, what happens if there's a denial of service scenario in this event? Or what happens if this service is down and not able to talk to each other? Like, what's the backup? How do we treat failure modes, et cetera? Like, those are things that people are like, oh yeah, I didn't really actually think about that. And that's where I see a lot of value coming from security, because we can be like, well, what happens in a worst case? And people appreciate that and understand why that worst case is bad. That's our job, is to help convey that and then design solutions to address those failure states that we know are bad from a security perspective within the app. That's been a tremendous value from an engineering org perspective.
Interesting. So we come alongside these teams as they're sort of conducting their activities, and it's not trying to stop them. It's actually trying to almost coach them, guide them, help them understand, and doing it in a way that is very natural for them. So for example, if we're doing requirements and we've got misuse cases, it's like, okay, functionally, we think a user would do it this way. Are there possibilities of somebody coming in and trying to do this in a malicious way? And it's like, well, we don't normally think about it that way, but let's take a step back and consider what might happen and what mitigations can we now put in place. And so the mindset begins to change, to start to get some of these things going as well. And I think the other thing that I got out of what the two of you were saying just now, even though we're walking our way through the software development lifecycle, it does not imply that this is linear. Right? We can have something happening in the design stage that comes up, which then goes back and helps with the requirements, or something comes up with requirements, which might help us later on with something else, as an example. So it's a continuous kind of way of looking at it. Right. And so all of these activities are all kind of interlinked at this point, because security is something that, like, more broadly goes across the life cycle, not being perceived, as Simona said, as something that's kind of like standalone off to the side, and this is what you do, and now this is what you do, but instead coming in and helping to realize how we can build secure products and secure software going forward. So let's now kind of move forward, and let's take a look at the coding stage now. So in coding, we've got secure coding standards. We'll have like SAST scanning, for example. Simone, I'd like to jump in and offer your thoughts. When we get into the core of the software development activity, people, developers could be in their IDE. They could be, doing a number of different things, testing, unit testing, things like that. What are some of the things that a security team can do for this specific activity around the coding phase?
Well, I will say that nowadays, the big change that we are seeing related to coding and related to security is the adoption of automation tools. You have told about the SaaS tools. There are DAS tools, for example, that would instead focus on the dynamic execution of the code to identify, through scanning, potential vulnerabilities. There are software composition analysis tools and a lot of other characteristics, a lot of other tools that are invented almost daily. Now, those tools are, from what I'm saying, are replacing in big part the role of the security expert in most teams, which from a certain point of view makes sense, but there are some aspects that, of course, cannot be addressed by those tools, like, for example, secure code review. That's something that they cannot do, and will typically identify different type of issues. But let's focus on those tools and what are the problems, because we are focusing on enabling versus blocking. So
Yeah.
what can block here a development tool? It's automation, right? It's perfect. It's something that will accelerate your check of the code and everything works wonderfully. Yeah, we wish, of course. The real problem is that a lot of those tools create a lot of false positives. And this means that the developers needed to validate, in particular, the very first phases of the project, that what they get is correct. Then you can tweak those tools. You can make some of those false positives, you can hide them so they will not burden too much. But it's a lot of work, additional work that needs to be done by developers to get real value. And I'm not even starting to talk about specialized tools versus generic tools. Because if we consider the generic scanning tools, static code analysis tools, they will identify a lot of other problems. And you will try to identify, it's like the proverbial needle in the haystack. It's what is really important. It may be very important, very difficult. And not only that, but depending on the type of tool that you are using, some issues may not be identified. If the tool focuses, for example, only on the code that is executed directly by your application, and not, for example, on the storage procedures that you have on the databases, what happens? That you may have a SQL injection because you do other things with your storage procedures, but you feel right. Okay, I'm safe. I do not have any problem in those. The tool tells me that I'm safe. So still, I think that there are potential for having blockers in that part. That in that case, it will not be a fault of the development teams, but in a way, of the security teams, but in a way, security will be a potential blocker. And an angle to that is that if I'm a developer and I write a piece of code and I have to work days to fix all those findings, and only a few of them are really relevant, the next time I will think twice before using this sort of tool. And this is going to create a problem because by extent, all the security tools become a problem, not a value.
So on the one hand, we do want to have automation, but on the other hand, if not configured properly, we end up with a lot of false positives. The challenge we have, of course, is that configuring these tools may in fact take some effort on the part of the security teams. And so we've got, now this problem in the coding space. How do we make this as efficient as possible? Spencer, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I like to think of it as more we're providing, a security team should be providing additional telemetry into an existing development workflow. So however your devs interact with those test results, or like what testing frameworks you're using or what testing tools. So that like there's plenty of specialized SaaS tools, for example, but then there's also like a lot of generalized, like how does the code smell? Are there like glorified linters? So being able to hook into that same process and that same flow, that's a benefit from a security standpoint, because the devs already have figured that out. Like they know, like if I have to run this linter to format my code and I always have to make sure that it comes back clean, if we can hook into that same workflow, whether it's within the SC or source code management platform that we're using, or like whatever our pipeline is, having security products and tests look the same as development tests, the better we can do that, the better adoption will be, right? So I think the other thing, to Simone's point, is the automating away like our jobs. I would like to automate away all of the things that I really don't want to spend time on, right? Like I really don't want to look at dependencies. So I for sure will slap an SCA tool to give developers a hint that, hey, this package is out of date, you need to go and update it. That's something that can easily automate away. So I should be picking tools in my SDLC that are easy to implement at first, that have very low maintenance and provide good telemetry. Like that's my ramp up, and giving developers that feedback of these are the things that should be addressed. And as much, signal to noise ratio should be really crisp on anything that we're putting in from an automation standpoint. Otherwise, it's just those are tools that we're using for additional telemetry on the security team. And we want to have it be crisp, because if I look, like every place I've been, it's like one security AppSec person for 100 developers. Like it's the ratio is insane. So we want to make sure that we can take those things that are very easy to figure out, whether that's security linters and SCA tools, and stick them into a pipeline. That's what we want to focus on. And then we can figure out how we want to do complicated dynamic testing or pen testing. Like those are things that are much higher finesse, much higher security engineering involvement. We can focus on that instead of those other things downstream. The other thing that I know has been talked about a lot, and I'm hoping we'll get better adoption, is writing security unit tests and functional tests. So just because you have a unit test framework or an integration test framework doesn't mean the security can't get involved in that too, right? Like, why shouldn't we be writing unit tests and integration tests that have security concepts in mind, right? Like break passwords on your unit test, see how's the app actually going to behave. Or if I'm going to start injecting Unicode characters all over the place, like those are really easy tests to write from a development standpoint, and doesn't take a whole lot of time for a developer to actually implement, but can have great scale, great efficiency of results back, because now you're still speaking the same language because it's a unit test. Devs know what unit tests are. And most of our things are relatively stable. So if you write, for example, an authorization or authentication unit test once, you're probably going to be using that for quite some time. And so you get a lot of ROI for some initial upfront work to set it all up, but that's going to persist down the road and help against things like regressions, which if you're iterating multiple times a day, regressions it's the hardest thing to try to accommodate for, because you can't test fast enough to catch those things where you're committing sins of the past.
Yeah, and it keeps growing. So we had talked about different tools and trying to see if we can sort of pick out the low-hanging fruit in making this as easy as possible for some of this automation to take place. Simone, any final thoughts on this? We've got a wide range of tools, and just each tool is specialized a little bit. You had brought some of that out. Any other comments that you have around this?
Yes, there is one actually related to the severity of the findings that those tools are identifying. And this is a consideration. Typically, the level of severity that those tools identify may be not so correct based on what you would have. And there are a couple of reasons why it is like that. First of all, they lack the background. They do not know the business. They do not know why you have that solution. Is the stability of the solution a concern more than the integrity of the data, or about the fact that the data could be disclosed? It depends on the solution. In some cases, you may not care in any way if your data is disclosed because it is public. So who cares if someone gets access to that data? So, and this is something that is very important, because if you lack that background, how can you say that a SQL injection, for example, is a critical issue? It's in the OWASP top 10. Yes, of course, anyone loves OWASP top 10, but it doesn't mean that it is critical. It depends on the actual solution. There is also another angle related to the fact that the application itself is somewhat biased, because when I write an application, a tool to check the code, if it can identify very important risks, very important issues, then I'm cool, then I'm good. That's an application, that's a tool that really is important. So you may have a bias in that, and you may tend to have higher levels of risk represented than really you have. This is also something that some security experts have as an issue. In particular, when you are just starting, you may tend to think that it is very important for your customer, for your interlocutor, that they address those issues. They are security issues. They are important. Come on. So you need to fix them. But the real thing is that it's not necessarily true. A lot of security issues are minor. They are not exploitable or hardly exploitable, or simply for any reason the business would decide to accept it. And we needed to ensure that the information that the business receives is correct from that point of view. And how can you achieve that with a tool that doesn't know anything about your business? You simply can't, and it's not the tool fault. Even if you target in a way that tool, you trigger that, you configure it, still it doesn't know your specific application. So that's a problem.
Yeah, so I think therein lies an opportunity if a security team comes in and says, hold on, what looks like a lot of work that we have to do, there is a portion of this that we don't even need to think about, right? And therein take some of the pressure off and keep the teams moving forward, right? We still need to go, we still need to do things. We'll get this thing done. Speed is often a concern, and by removing some of these blockers and giving a long list of things which may or may not contextually be applicable is a big problem. So there's some thinking that goes into this to say, okay, and I think to some of the other things that we talked about earlier, having a discussion with architects and designers and understanding the requirements. So as an example, if we have to comply with something, it's one thing, from a legal standpoint, let's say, but if it's something that's like a nice to have, then from a business standpoint, maybe there are other mitigations that can be put in place to help us and still build our systems around the level of risk tolerance that is acceptable to the business ultimately. And it's a valid point. So we've gone from the requirements, then we took a look at the design stage and what could be done in that. And then we talked a little bit about the coding and some of the automation tools that are there and how security teams can help enable that, to promote a lean way of thinking. Let's now go in and talk about testing. So many times we have testing folded into the development stage. So we've got, test-driven development, for example, those kinds of concepts. But for the purposes of this discussion, let's say that there's some set of activities around testing that need to happen. Functional testing, security testing. We've got some things in there where we've got a team that comes in now and needs to focus on making sure that we're meeting the original intent of the requirements. So from a security perspective, are there things that a security team can do to help testers? And I'm going to ask you, Spencer, to just chime in initially on this particular aspect. Once again, we've got tools in this space. We've got DAS tools, we've got IaaS, we've got, people can come in and use all these various tools to help to automate some of this stuff. But what does it mean when we say that security teams are blocking the testers from moving forward efficiently, and what can we do to unblock that? Spencer?
Yeah, so I think that kind of like we talked about integrating security into the dev flow, from a security testing perspective, you really need to be integrated into how QA is handled within your org, right? Some might be a separate QA team, might be still the same developers doing QA testing. You need to figure out how you can hook into that QA harness test, for example. Like if that doesn't exist, your security testing is going to have a really bad time, because I've never seen a successful security test when you don't have a staging environment, or you don't have an idea of how flow through the application should be done. Like all of these things are things that security teams need to be able to conduct really good security tests. Otherwise, you're kind of like black boxing it, and your results aren't going to be as good. And you're not going to be like in the SDLC. You're going to be outside of it looking in. So I think harmonizing with your QA approach is of the utmost importance. And then speaking the same language, right? So I am really wary of having security blockers on tests, because again, you go back to, you need to validate the results that you're getting. More than likely, you need some time, because there's not an easy way to just click a button and have your security tests, you're doing full regression testing or functional testing, you're not going to have the time. So you're going to be out of band from how that's happening. And I think a lot of people are kind of wary of, well, I want to test before it ships to prod. If you're a super agile shop and you're deploying multiple times a day, you're not going to make it. There's no way. You cannot hire enough AppSec people to make that happen. But instead, focusing on the gap from time to deploy to time of fix, which is a very common development metric, applying that to security as well. Like, what's that window of opportunity that an attacker might have stumbled across that cross-site scripting or that SQL injection, right? And so obviously there's a different scale to kind of what Smo is saying, like there's scale of types of vulns and how much they matter to you. That's also important. But, being able to clearly say, these are the things that are the issue, and this is the window that we need to shorten. That's that's what you should be focusing on security testing, because you're not going to try to find everything. You just need to find more things than the bad guys are going to find, right? And I know a lot of folks are starting to ramp up bug bounty programs, which are amazing because that's basically outsourced QA testing, which sounds bad from a security research perspective, but it's amazing when you're on the inside, because if I can have, you know, thousands of people testing a feature as it's rolling out the door, I know I'm going to get that done really quick. And every security researcher has their own expertise and thing that they focus on and personal experiences. So being able to decentralize that and crowdsource it means you're probably going to get better testing, right? So I know that's definitely a way that I prefer to go, and looking at DAST, because you have to, like, we just don't have enough AppSec engineers to properly tune a DAST test for your bajillions of applications that are in your portfolio. If you do, awesome. Maybe I want to come work there. But for the most part, like crowdsourcing, that's super clutch. And then you can again focus on shortening that window of exposure.
Simone, your thoughts?
Well, mostly in the same lines. I will say that in many cases there is not a strong separation between those phases we are talking about. Nowadays, with the DevSecOps, everything is a little blended, right? So to me, the adoption of those tools that we have discussed for automation are really in part addressing the need for development, in part addressing the need for test. Here, we may talk also about the validation activities, or did you intend to talk about the validation activities later? Perhaps,
no, bring it up now. No, go ahead.
Okay. So a very important aspect is first that all those phases are addressing different type of risks. So the threat modeling is addressing risks related to the design. The various tools that we have talked about are SaaS tools are addressing tools specifically in the code based on some known patterns. DAS tools about the dynamic execution of the code. But they are not identifying the same problems. They are identifying slightly different problems. Perhaps some of those problems will fall in one category on the other, but not everything. So you needed to have them. You needed to have also secure code reviews where you have an expert looking through your code, and you needed to have penetration tests, which are the validation tests that you can do at the end. Of course, after you have done all those activities earlier, hopefully the penetration test will identify nothing of importance, but sometimes it identifies something important. And another aspect that is very important from my point of view is that returning to our initial topic, blocking versus enabling, all those tests can provide false positives, including penetration tests. And it's very important to execute them all, because that will allow you to get a real understanding about the security of your solution, and will allow to tell, okay, this is a false positive. I have an experience with the penetration test that has identified a lot of those false positives, including situations in which libraries have been identified having vulnerabilities simply because they were exposed. And for example, in year 2000, they had some known problem, and the tester didn't think to check if the vulnerability was present also in the version that it tested 17 years after the original one was fixed. So you see, there are these sort of things. Everyone is a human, and we make mistakes. Only if you understand the different risks, you can call it is a true risk. It is something that is not important, and having this understanding allows really to address those problems very fast. If the For example, they are telling you, okay, your solution is unsecure because your code could be reverse engineered, and you need to obfuscate it. This is a real life example. And when I received this from a penetration tester, I was able to tell, okay, but I don't care if someone does the reverse engineering. In the code, there is nothing really important because there is no secret. There is nothing that would represent a problem. So why should I do things that can be addressed very easy, finding on GitHub, for example, some piece of code that can reverse reverse engineer the same code, and you can have this conversation in a way that would really help you to save a lot of money and to save a lot of time and to go in production much earlier. Knowing that the risks that you have that have been identified are not so important.
Yeah. So then let's talk about the last part now. So there's a lot of talk about CI/CD, and so when we talk about the continuous delivery model at this point, the last stage, eventually we've done all these tests, we've gone through each of these stages. Cross-functional teams are working together, and now we've got to package this thing, and it needs to be ready to be deployed at any point in time. Within that space, and again, for our conversation today, we were really looking at the software development aspect. There's a whole operational security side to this, and how security cannot it's become a bottleneck for that. Perhaps we can do that conversation at some point in the future. But for now, the end state that we're looking for from a software development standpoint is really the final deployment of that package that needs to go out. And so sometimes when we look at how we might be able to, for example, code sign, making sure that we protect the integrity of the build itself, making sure that even from a release standpoint, the release pipeline is secure. These are all enablers that security teams can put in place to help ensure the quality of the product that goes out. And I just want to start, Simone, any thoughts on how a security team can help to facilitate creating a lean process when we get to the final stages where we're really getting ready to release this now from a delivery standpoint?
The important topic here is to really understand what matters. So I think that the most important aspect, the most important goal of a security expert will be to put in contact the business with the developers to ensure that what is shipped is really in line with what is required from the solution in a reasonable way, to enable the decisions. And it's when we are talking about shipping, it becomes very important to give the awareness and the understanding about the security of the solution, and to provide the required assurance that would eventually allow to demonstrate the due diligence in case of problems. So this is definitely something that I would search from a security team.
Yeah. Spencer, your thoughts?
I think a lot of value can be gained with a security team that's tightly integrated. So if you have like artifact validation requirements, or we need to make sure that the thing that actually is going out is correct. Normally, there's a compliance team, and normally they might not be as like, if we're not integrated in the dev teams, the compliance team is more than likely not super well integrated either.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot of value add that we can achieve from a cross-functional team perspective by helping to translate, like, here's the compliance requirements, here's what happened over here in dev land. Well, a security team can get in the middle and help make sure the two teams understand it, and kind of almost act as interpreters between those two entities. So there's a lot of value that can be gleaned from that, and then helping to make sure that those requirements, because security normally, like, we get why compliance is doing the things that they are doing, making sure that those things are met in the product spec. So we're able to take those requirements from compliance, make sure they're happening up front. More than likely, it can be automated. So maybe we take that on to help drive some of that automation or ensuring that those controls are in place. But I see a lot of value add from that perspective because it's one less thing that a dev team has to worry about. That at the end of the day, if we're going to audit it, security team's probably going to be called into play to validate that yes, we actually did do that thing. So I see that being a super big driver. But again, it depends on what are those actual requirements. I've never had to code cite anything in my career, so it's very up to like what kind of products you're working on and the environment that those things get deployed to, et cetera. So
Yeah. It's interesting now as we kind of come to the end of our discussion today. The idea, the mindset change from having this, a team that is acting or perceived as a blocker, even though their intent may be quite different, by going through a series of activities that are very actionable, very practical, we can start to steer the ship and get people on board with thinking about security as being a normal part of how we do software development. It's not something that is separate. It's not something that's added on. The intent is not to slow things down, but I think because of the role that security plays in many organizations, to the last comment that you just made, Spencer, there's a chance to go in and act as a facilitator to bring these various teams together as well, which may be too far of a stretch for someone on the development team to reach out as an example. All right. And I think, Simone, to the point you raised earlier about having a security champion in here, helping to translate some of these things from a development perspective and opening that conversation up now, right? But what we've discussed today are some tangible steps that we can take to take us from where we are in many cases today, that is largely reactive, to a posture that is more proactive and aligned with what the business is looking for, but doing it in a way that comes alongside these various teams in the SDLC to say, look, we're actually here to help you. And we get feedback too, right? Like if this isn't working, this is too much, the tools are giving a lot of false positives. Well, let's sit down and let's kind of figure this out. But thinking and taking DevOps and DevSecOps really to that level where we are trying to all work together to help produce a product that is ultimately going to be secure. Well, it's been a wonderful conversation. Our hour just basically flew by really quickly. I know the two of you, I know we can talk for a lot more on this, but we've come to an end, and I think we have to bring the webinar to a land at this point. So I'd like to turn it over to Raquel to just talk about some potential next steps and kind of where we go from here. Raquel, over to you.
Yes, well, once again, Spencer, Simone, and Altaz, thank you for another great session. Just to let everyone know here that we do have webinars lined up for the remainder of the year. So if you're interested in attending any of these webinars, please do visit the upcoming events and webinar section of our website to sign up. We do hope that everyone found this presentation insightful. And again, we will be providing a link to the recording of this webinar here via email. So thank you so much again for attending. Stay safe, and I hope you all have a great day.